San Francisco Harbor, October 8, 1944, 07:45 hours. Nurse Kimiko Tanaka stands on the deck of a hospital ship, watching the Golden Gate Bridge emerge from the Pacific mist, and she cannot reconcile what she sees with everything the Empire told her about America's crumbling infrastructure and failing civilization. Tanaka, a military nurse captured when American forces overran the field hospital on Saipan, has spent the last 6 weeks expecting to find a nation exhausted by war, cities darkened by privation, a society collapsing under the weight of moral decay that imperial propaganda promised defined the Western democracies. What Kimiko Tanaka cannot possibly know, what no Japanese woman raised on the emperor's teachings could imagine even in their most disturbing nightmares, is that within hours she will witness hospitals equipped with medical technology that makes Japanese military medicine seem medieval, factories producing consumer goods in quantities that exceed Japan's entire industrial output, and American women living with freedoms and opportunities that Japanese propaganda insisted would destroy social order and family structure. And within days, her understanding of technological progress, social organization, the role of women, and the fundamental reasons Japan is losing the war will be obliterated so completely by the overwhelming evidence of American advancement that she will question every truth the Empire taught her about the West, about modernity, and about which civilization truly represents humanity's future. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Imperial Japanese military's employment of women in auxiliary roles reflects desperate measures rather than social progress, as military nurses like Tanaka serve in conditions that barely meet basic medical standards. Army nurse Yuki Yamamoto, captured alongside Tanaka when their hospital was overrun, has internalized the official narrative that Japanese women sacrifice for the emperor's divine mission, that Western women live in moral degradation despite material comfort, and that Japan's spiritual purity will overcome America's soulless mechanization. She expects American medical facilities to reflect the moral corruption that propaganda describes, impersonal, mechanized, lacking the spiritual dedication that Japanese nurses bring to caring for wounded soldiers. The propaganda machinery of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere has spent years preparing Japanese women for specific expectations about America, a nation where racial mixing has created social chaos, where women's liberation has destroyed family structures, where material abundance masks spiritual emptiness and moral decay, where technology has advanced at the cost of human values. Civilian Sachiko Watanabe, swept up in Saipan's fall and classified as POW despite her non-combatant status, carries mental images shaped by Japanese newsreels showing American race riots, propaganda films depicting Western moral dissolution, and ideological instruction emphasizing that American wealth comes from exploiting Asia rather than genuine productivity. What makes October 8, 1944 different from every expectation becomes immediately apparent as the hospital ship docks and Japanese prisoners witness San Francisco's waterfront operating at a scale that suggests unlimited resources rather than wartime scarcity. The port teems with activity, cargo ships being loaded with supplies for the Pacific Theater, naval vessels receiving maintenance and provisioning, civilian commerce continuing alongside military operations with an integration that suggests total mobilization without social collapse. The bridge itself, an engineering marvel spanning the bay with a grace that seems almost impossible, represents technological achievement that contradicts every claim about American industrial decline. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kimiko Tanaka, watching longshoremen operate mechanical equipment that moves cargo with efficiency Japanese ports could never match, experiences the first crack in her ideological certainty. The equipment alone, Electric cranes, motorized forklifts, conveyor systems represents capital investment that war-strained Japan could never afford. More disturbing, some of the equipment operators are women, performing heavy industrial work that Japanese doctrine insists is physically impossible for females and socially destructive when attempted. The cognitive dissonance between ideology and observation creates a psychological discomfort that Tanaka tries to dismiss as temporary confusion that further experience will clarify. The medical processing through military custody reveals American approaches to healthcare that shock nurses trained in Japanese military medicine's resource-constrained improvisation. Lieutenant Commander Helen Richardson, a Navy nurse handling prisoner medical evaluation, conducts examinations using equipment that Japanese military hospitals lack: X-ray machines for routine diagnostic imaging, laboratory facilities that can perform blood tests within hours, pharmaceutical supplies that include antibiotics and pain medications in quantities that seem almost wasteful. Richardson treats the Japanese prisoners with clinical professionalism that assumes their medical needs matter regardless of enemy status, explaining procedures in careful English translated by a Nisei interpreter who bridges the linguistic and cultural gap. The transport to a military medical facility for treatment of injuries and tropical diseases exposes Japanese nurses to American medicine operating at technological levels they cannot comprehend. Letterman General Hospital in San Francisco's Presidio represents medical capability that makes Japanese military medicine seem primitive by comparison. Army nurse Yuki Yamamoto, herself requiring treatment for malaria contracted on Saipan, receives care that includes intravenous fluids, anti-malarial drugs in sufficient quantities for complete treatment rather than minimal doses stretched to serve more patients, and monitoring equipment that tracks her vital signs continuously rather than through periodic manual checks. The hospital's scale and equipment create profound psychological impact on women who served in field hospitals where shortages of everything from bandages to morphine define daily reality. The surgical suites contain equipment that Japanese military hospitals reserve for the most critical cases if they possess it at all. Electrical surgical lights that illuminate operating fields with daylight brightness, anesthesia equipment that allows precise control of patient consciousness, sterilization equipment that ensures surgical tools meet standards Japanese field hospitals can only approximate. Army nurse Tanaka, observing an American surgical team through an observation window, watches procedures performed with a casualness that suggests abundant resources. Surgeons using disposable supplies that Japanese hospitals would sterilize and reuse multiple times. Nurses discarding materials that Japanese medical personnel would carefully preserve. The pharmaceutical supplies particularly shock nurses who rationed medications carefully in Japanese service. The hospital pharmacy stocks medications in quantities that seem almost obscene to women who stretched limited supplies across dozens of patients. Penicillin, the miracle antibiotic that Japanese medicine has only in experimental quantities, is used routinely for infections that Japanese doctors would treat with less effective sulfa drugs or nothing at all. Pain medications are administered liberally rather than reserved for the most severe cases, reflecting an assumption that patient comfort matters rather than being a luxury that resource constraints prevent. The exposure to civilian San Francisco provides even more devastating evidence of American technological advancement. Sachiko Watanabe, granted supervised visits to the city as her civilian status is clarified, discovers urban infrastructure operating at levels that Tokyo never achieved even in peacetime. The electrical grid provides power so reliably that Americans consider lights operating continuously as normal rather than a luxury requiring conservation. The water system delivers clean water under pressure to every building, making the elaborate water conservation measures that define Japanese urban life seem primitive. The telephone system connects calls reliably, creating communications infrastructure that Japanese cities cannot match. The transportation systems demonstrate American engineering applied to civilian life in ways that reveal systematic investment in infrastructure that Japan never achieved. The streetcars running on electrical power, buses operating on regular schedules, and private automobiles numbering in the thousands just in one city suggest a transportation capacity that makes Japanese urban mobility seem medieval. Nurse Yamamoto, riding a streetcar through the city, calculates that this single form of public transportation moves more people daily than all of Tokyo's streetcar system combined. And the casualness with which Americans treat this capability suggests they consider it ordinary rather than exceptional. The consumer abundance visible in San Francisco's stores delivers the most psychologically devastating evidence that Japanese propaganda systematically lied about American society. The department stores stock goods in varieties that seem impossible to someone from a nation where rationing has defined daily life since the China War began in 1937. Macy's and other retailers display clothing, household goods, and luxuries that would be available only to wealthy families in Japan, if available at all. The prices, while high by Japanese standards, are accessible to working-class Americans whose wages exceed what Japanese professionals earn, suggesting an economic system that distributes prosperity broadly rather than concentrating it among elites. The encounter with American women living with freedoms that Japanese propaganda insisted would destroy society creates the most profound ideological crisis. The American nurses the Japanese prisoners interact with are not just medical technicians but educated professionals who exercise independent judgment, challenge physician decisions when they believe patient care requires it, and expect their expertise to be respected. Lieutenant Richardson, explaining treatment protocols to Nurse Tanaka, discusses medical literature she has read, conferences she has attended, and professional development she pursues, treating nursing as a career requiring continuous learning rather than a temporary service role before marriage. The contrast with Japanese women's social position proves as stark and undeniable. In Japan, even educated women like military nurses occupy subordinate status, expected to defer to male authority regardless of their expertise, discouraged from pursuing advanced education, taught that true female fulfillment comes through marriage and motherhood rather than professional achievement. The American system, while not offering complete equality, provides paths to authority and recognition based on competence rather than gender. The American nurses work alongside physicians as colleagues rather than subordinates, participate in treatment decisions, and advance to supervisory positions based on merit rather than being restricted by biological sex. The civilian American women whom the Japanese prisoners observed during supervised outings embody possibilities that Japanese propaganda taught were destructive aberrations rather than viable life paths. The women working in offices, driving automobiles, pursuing education at universities, and participating in public life without male supervision represent social organization that Japanese ideology insists is unnatural and doomed to collapse. Yet American society functions effectively despite, or perhaps because of, integrating women into economic and intellectual life. The women appear neither degraded nor masculinized despite their participation in activities Japanese culture reserves for men, suggesting that gender restrictions serve ideological purposes rather than reflecting biological necessity. The systematic exposure to American reality forces Japanese prisoners to confront the magnitude of imperial propaganda's deception. Nurse Tanaka, possessing medical training that provides framework for evaluating healthcare systems, recognizes that the technological superiority, resource abundance, and systematic organization she observes are genuine rather than theatrical deception. The scale alone prevents fabrication. An entire city cannot be staged. Hospitals cannot fake their equipment inventories, and the casual confidence of American personnel cannot be entirely performance art maintained for weeks to deceive prisoners. The letters from family in Japan that begin arriving through Red Cross channels provide devastating confirmation that Japanese reality has diverged catastrophically from the propaganda narrative. Kimiko Tanaka's sister writes carefully coded messages describing conditions in Tokyo: constant air raid alerts, food rations insufficient for adequate nutrition,
manufacturing disrupted by bombing and material shortages, and pervasive fear that prevents honest discussion even within families. The contrast between her sister's veiled descriptions of deprivation and what Tanaka observes in San Francisco forces recognition that imperial claims about American weakness and Japanese strength have inverted reality, that America grows stronger while Japan exhausts itself, that American civilians live better than Japanese civilians, and that the ideological system she served has systematically deceived her. The news from the Pacific Theater compounds the psychological crisis as Japanese prisoners learn about island garrisons falling to American assaults that employ overwhelming material superiority. The reports describe American forces landing with equipment and supplies in quantities that Japanese defenders cannot match. Naval gunfire that pulverizes fortifications Japanese engineers believed could withstand any bombardment, and air support that achieves complete dominance over Japanese positions. The systematic nature of American victories suggests not temporary advantage, but fundamental superiority in industrial capacity, technological application, and resource availability, exactly the opposite of what imperial propaganda promised about spiritual strength overcoming material weakness.
The cognitive dissonance creates psychological crisis more profound than physical captivity because it requires confronting the possibility that everything Japanese education and propaganda taught was systematically false. Nurse Yamamoto, lying awake in the detention facility, must reconcile her service to the empire with growing recognition that she fought for a regime that lied about America's capabilities, about Japan's prospects, about the nature of modern warfare, and about women's potential contributions to society. The ideology that defined her identity and gave meaning to her sacrifices now appears as propaganda designed to manipulate, rather than truth revealing reality. The comparison between Japanese and American approaches to women's roles becomes unavoidable as prisoners spend months observing American society. Army Nurse Tanaka, participating in medical training sessions that American authorities allow as professional development, learns about nursing education pathways in America, university degree programs that combine medical training with general education, professional organizations that advocate for nurses' interests, and career advancement based on expertise rather than gender. The assumption that nurses are medical professionals deserving respect and development opportunities, rather than support personnel serving temporarily before marriage, represents a fundamental difference in how societies value women's contributions. The recognition that Japanese ideology systematically undervalued women's capabilities creates particular bitterness among prisoners whose competence was constrained by social restrictions. Nurse Tanaka, who managed field hospital operations on Saipan, recognizes that her administrative and medical capabilities were limited by ideology that denied women could exercise command authority regardless of competence. The American nurses she meets, commanding units, managing complex medical programs, exercising authority based on ability, demonstrate that gender restrictions serve ideology rather than capability. Tanaka begins questioning whether Japan's approach to women represents not cultural tradition, but systematic waste of human potential that the nation cannot afford during existential struggle. The autumn of 1944 brings news of American victories in the Philippines that forces even the most ideologically committed prisoners to confront reality. As American forces liberate Manila and push Japanese defenders into desperate last stands, the pattern becomes undeniable. American material superiority overcomes Japanese defensive positions regardless of how determined the defenders or how well constructed the fortifications. The ease with which American forces accomplish objectives that Japanese propaganda insisted would require years validates what the prisoners learned through observing American industrial capacity, that Japan never possessed the resources to win a prolonged war against an enemy who could produce ships, aircraft, and munitions at scales that made Japanese output seem negligible. The treatment of prisoners itself provides evidence of systematic differences between Japanese and American values. The medical care, adequate food, housing that meets basic standards, and respect for Geneva Convention requirements all contrast sharply with reports of how Japanese forces treated Allied prisoners. The cognitive dissonance between the barbaric enemy that propaganda described and the professional military personnel who actually guard them forces recognition that imperial propaganda systematically distorted reality to maintain fighting spirit, rather than conveying accurate information about the enemy. The educational opportunities that American authorities tentatively offer, language classes, lectures on American history and government, access to reading materials, take on different meaning for women who witnessed evidence that democratic systems can mobilize resources and human potential in ways that imperial ideology cannot match. Civilian Sachiko Watanabe, attending English language classes, encounters American ideas about individual rights, limited government, and democratic participation that contradict everything Japanese education taught about Western political systems. The teacher, a Nisei woman who embodies both Japanese heritage and American citizenship, represents possibilities that imperial ideology insisted were impossible, that racial identity and national loyalty could transcend the blood nationalism that imperial doctrine made absolute. The spring of 1945 brings opportunities for Japanese female POWs to witness American society beyond military facilities and supervised city visits. Nurse Kimiko Tanaka, transferred to a work program at a civilian hospital in Oakland as part of a medical exchange initiative, discovers that American healthcare excellence extends throughout the society rather than being reserved for military facilities. Highland Hospital treats civilian patients with the same advanced equipment and abundant resources she witnessed at Letterman: X-ray machines for routine diagnostics, laboratory testing available within hours, pharmaceutical supplies that seem unlimited by Japanese standards. The casual assumption that ordinary civilians deserve advanced medical care rather than having such resources reserved for military needs or wealthy patients represents a fundamental difference in how societies value human life. The interaction with civilian American women proves even more psychologically devastating than encounters with military personnel because it reveals that professional opportunities and personal freedoms are not wartime aberrations, but structural features of American society. Nurse Yuki Yamamoto, working alongside American civilian nurses, learns that her colleagues built nursing careers before the war, plan to continue after it, and view professional work as normal female aspiration rather than temporary service before marriage. The hospital's head nurse, a woman named Margaret Sullivan with 20 years of experience, exercises authority over male physicians when protocols require it, commands respect based on expertise rather than gender, and mentors younger nurses with the assumption that they will pursue long-term careers. The home visits that some prisoners receive as part of cultural familiarization programs expose them to American domestic life that contradicts every imperial propaganda claim about Western family dissolution. Civilian Sachiko Watanabe, invited to dinner with a San Francisco family whose son serves in the Navy, discovers a household where the mother works as a schoolteacher, the teenage daughter plans to attend college, and family decisions are made through discussion rather than patriarchal decree. The family functions harmoniously despite the mother's professional work, the children respect both parents' authority, and the household maintains order without the rigid gender hierarchies the Japanese ideology insists are necessary for social stability. The detailed comparisons Japanese prisoners make between their experiences in the empire and observations of American society reveal systematic differences that transcend military outcomes or economic development levels. The most fundamental difference emerges in how each society conceives of individual worth and social organization. In Imperial Japan, individuals exist to serve the collective as defined by the emperor and interpreted by military authorities, with worth determined by utility to national goals. In America, despite its many contradictions and failings, the system recognizes individuals as possessing inherent rights that the state must respect, rather than being merely resources for state purposes. The educational systems demonstrate this philosophical difference in concrete ways. Nurse Tanaka, visiting San Francisco public schools as part of an educational exchange program, discovers that American education emphasizes critical thinking and individual development rather than memorization and obedience to authority. Students question teachers' assertions, debate ideas openly, and engage with knowledge as active participants rather than passive recipients.
The female students study the same curriculum as males, receive encouragement to pursue advanced education, and encounter no systematic discrimination based on gender that would direct them toward domestic roles rather than intellectual development. The economic systems reveal similar patterns of fundamental philosophical difference. American capitalism, whatever its flaws and inequalities, operates through voluntary exchange and distributed decision-making that allows innovation and adaptation. The prosperity Japanese prisoners observe comes not from exploiting conquered territories, as imperial propaganda insisted, but from productive systems that generate genuine wealth through technological innovation and efficient organization. The recognition that democratic capitalism produces abundance through voluntary cooperation rather than requiring authoritarian direction forces uncomfortable questions about whether imperial economic models ever could have competed effectively. The treatment of ethnic minorities provides revealing context about American society's contradictions and possibilities. Japanese prisoners observe discrimination against Black Americans, notice segregation in some facilities, and witness prejudice that partially validates imperial propaganda about American racial problems. Yet the scale and systematic nature differ fundamentally from imperial racial policies. America does not pursue extermination or enslavement as state policy, does not treat entire populations as biologically inferior subhumans, and contains internal movements advocating for equality that would be ruthlessly suppressed in Imperial Japan. The imperfect democracy struggles with its contradictions rather than enforcing them as natural order. The individual journeys through this confrontation with American reality follow different paths reflecting each prisoner's background and psychological resilience. Army nurse Yuki Yamamoto undergoes the most complete transformation, abandoning imperial ideology to embrace democratic values she observes functioning effectively. She begins corresponding with American nurses she worked with, expressing interest in remaining in America after the war if possible, and planning to pursue nursing education that would be unavailable in Japan. Yamamoto's letters to her sister in Tokyo carefully avoid criticizing the emperor, but convey that American society functions well despite its freedoms, that women can pursue careers without destroying families, and that democratic systems mobilize human potential effectively. Civilian Sachiko Watanabe, transformation proves more gradual and conflicted, marked by resistance to conclusions that evidence makes increasingly unavoidable. Watanabe clings to aspects of Japanese identity and culture, even while recognizing that imperial propaganda systematically deceived her about America. She distinguishes between Japanese cultural traditions, which she values, and imperial ideology, which she now questions, attempting to preserve identity while abandoning the totalitarian system that claimed to represent Japanese civilization. Her struggle reflects the broader challenge facing Japan: how to maintain cultural identity while rejecting the militaristic imperialism that led to catastrophe.
Nurse Kimiko Tanaka's journey combines professional recognition with ideological crisis in ways that prove particularly painful. As a medical professional, she cannot deny that American healthcare represents technological and organizational superiority over Japanese medicine. Yet accepting this superiority requires acknowledging that the empire sent her to serve in field hospitals that lacked resources for adequate care, that her medical training emphasized spiritual dedication precisely because material resources were inadequate, and that Japanese casualties suffered unnecessarily because the nation could not provide medical capabilities that America considers basic standards. The recognition that her service involved inadequate medicine, rationalized as spiritual purity, creates anger at the system that exploited her dedication while providing insufficient resources. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 create moral complexity that prevents simple narratives about American superiority or Japanese victimhood. Japanese prisoners learning about the bombings experience horror at the civilian casualties, shock at weapons that obliterate entire cities in single explosions, and profound relief that the war has ended, preventing invasion that would have killed millions more on both sides. Nurse Tanaka, learning that Hiroshima, where her aunt lived, has been destroyed, must process grief for family losses alongside recognition that the bombing ended a war Japan could not win and saved lives that invasion would have cost. The atomic weapons represent the ultimate expression of American technological superiority that imperial propaganda never acknowledged. Science applied to warfare at scales that Japanese researchers only theoretically imagined.
The Manhattan Project mobilized resources and scientific talent at levels impossible for Imperial Japan, produced weapons that transcended conventional military capabilities, and demonstrated that American industrial and scientific capacity exceeded Japanese understanding. For prisoners who spent months observing American society, the atomic bombs confirm rather than surprise. They represent the logical extension of the systematic superiority in resources, organization, and technology that defined every American advantage. The surrender announcement on August 15th arrives not as shock, but as confirmation of what months in American captivity made inevitable. Emperor Hirohito's radio address, the first time most Japanese have heard his voice, acknowledging defeat and calling for endurance of the unendurable, validates what prisoners learned through observing American power. The war that imperial ideology insisted Japan would win through spiritual strength has ended in total defeat, occupied homeland, and complete repudiation of the militaristic system that led the nation into catastrophe. For prisoners who already confronted these truths through exposure to American reality, the surrender formalizes recognition that came months earlier. The broader revelation of Japanese atrocities committed across Asia forces prisoners to confront their nation's moral culpability in ways that American technological superiority alone never could. The reports of massacres in China, brutal treatment of Allied prisoners, forced labor systems, and systematic exploitation of conquered populations emerge gradually as occupation forces document Japanese war crimes. Nurse Yamamoto, who served in China before her Pacific deployment, must confront memories of civilian suffering she witnessed but rationalized as necessary for the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, recognizing now that the propaganda justifying Japanese expansion was lies covering brutal conquest. The question of personal responsibility proves particularly acute because Japanese society's emphasis on collective identity and obedience to authority provides psychological escape from individual culpability. The excuse that "we followed orders" or "we served the emperor faithfully" seems sufficient in a culture that subordinates individual conscience to collective duty. Yet exposure to American emphasis on individual moral responsibility forces uncomfortable questions about whether following orders absolves participation in unjust systems, whether cultural traditions of obedience excuse enabling atrocities, and whether ordinary Japanese who supported the war effort bear responsibility for crimes committed in the nation's name. The comparison with American treatment of prisoners provides damning context that makes evasion difficult. Japanese prisoners received medical care, adequate food, and treatment respecting Geneva Convention standards, while Japanese forces tortured prisoners, worked them to death, and treated surrender as dishonorable regardless of circumstances. The systematic difference reflects not just resource availability, but fundamental values. Japanese military culture viewing enemy prisoners as contemptible, while American system maintaining standards even for enemies. The recognition that Japanese prisoners benefited from American adherence to international law that Japanese forces systematically violated creates moral debt that some prisoners acknowledge, while others spend lifetimes rationalizing. The repatriation process beginning in 1946 forces Japanese female prisoners to make practical choices about futures in a Japan they know will be devastated and occupied. The homeland they will return to exists more as concept than reality. Major cities destroyed by bombing, industrial capacity wrecked, economy collapsed, society undergoing forced transformation under American occupation. Some prisoners contemplate remaining in America if opportunities arise, drawn by technological advancement and personal freedoms that defeated Japan cannot provide. The immigration restrictions of the era make this difficult, but possibilities exist for those with special circumstances or American sponsors. Nurse Tanaka offered a position assisting with medical care for Japanese repatriates if she remains in America, must decide between returning to destroyed Japan or accepting work that would keep her in the nation that defeated her homeland. Her decision to remain reflects recognition that she can contribute more to Japanese recovery by developing expertise in American medical systems that occupation forces will introduce to Japan, that her family in Japan faces years of hardship she cannot alleviate by adding another mouth to feed, and that professional opportunities in devastated Japan will be scarce while American healthcare continues expanding. The choice involves practical calculation rather than betrayal, serving Japanese interests by learning from the victors rather than returning to share in collective suffering.
Nurse Yamamoto makes the opposite choice, determining to return to Japan despite offers of American employment. Her decision reflects commitment to help rebuild her homeland, recognition that educated medical professionals will be desperately needed for occupation and reconstruction, and desire to apply what she learned about American healthcare systems to improving Japanese medicine. Yamamoto plans to advocate for reforms incorporating American practices, greater professional autonomy for nurses, emphasis on evidence-based medicine rather than hierarchical tradition, and recognition of women's capabilities in medical leadership. Her transformation from imperial nurse to reform advocate represents the possibility that defeat might catalyze positive changes in Japanese society. Civilian Watanabe pursues education while awaiting repatriation, enrolling in university extension courses that prepare her for teaching work in occupied Japan. Her studies focus on English language and American educational methods, skills that occupation authorities will need for teaching Japanese students. Watanabe's pragmatic approach reflects recognition that Japan must learn from America to rebuild effectively, that resistance to occupation serves no purpose when the empire has utterly failed, and that her generation faces responsibility for creating a Japan that does not repeat catastrophic mistakes. The education she pursues represents a bridge between the defeated past and uncertain future. The influence of Japanese female prisoners' American experiences extends beyond individual transformations to affect post-war Japanese society in subtle but significant ways. The several dozen women who experienced American captivity returned to Japan carrying knowledge about alternative social organizations, societies where women pursue education and careers, where democratic systems function effectively, where technological advancement serves civilian welfare rather than being monopolized for military purposes. In the chaos of occupied Japan, these perspectives influence Reconstruction debates about what kind of society should emerge from imperial catastrophe. The comparison between imperial and democratic systems reveals advantages of open societies that transcend military outcomes or economic metrics. American strength came not just from industrial capacity, but from social systems that mobilized talent regardless of demographic characteristics, that educated populations broadly rather than restricting learning to elites, that encouraged innovation through freedom rather than controlling it through state direction. The democratic complexity that imperial ideology dismissed as weakness proved to be strength. Diversity of approaches, freedom to question and improve, and the assumption that ordinary people could contribute to society rather than merely obeying directives from authorities claiming divine mandate. The moral dimension cannot be separated from technological comparisons or social observations. Imperial Japan's industrial capabilities, whatever their achievements, served brutal conquest and exploitation justified by racial superiority claims. American society, despite its significant flaws and contradictions, did not pursue extermination as state policy, did not treat entire populations as subhuman, and maintained some moral boundaries even during total war. For Japanese prisoners confronting this reality, the recognition that they served a system fundamentally evil in its purposes, regardless of their personal intentions or limited individual roles, creates moral responsibility that some acknowledge while others spend lifetimes evading. The return to Japan forces former prisoners to reconcile their American experiences with post-war reality. The devastated cities, starving population, and occupied status create conditions where American abundance seems almost dreamlike, so removed from immediate Japanese reality that some returnees struggle to credit their own memories. Yet the lessons learned prove relevant precisely because Japan must rebuild from catastrophe, requiring every possible talent and resource to create new society from the ruins of imperial ambitions.
The choice facing Japanese women in post-war years, whether to pursue education and careers under occupation reforms or accept traditional domestic roles, reflects broader questions about what kind of society will emerge from defeat. Those who experienced American female professionals, who witnessed societies functioning with gender equality, who learned that women's capabilities extend beyond imperial ideology's restrictions, bring perspectives that influence these debates. The practical necessity of reconstruction, requiring educated workers regardless of gender, creates opportunities for Japanese women that pre-war society would never have provided, though implementation of genuine equality remains incomplete for decades. The legacy of Japanese female prisoners' American experiences lives on in the women who chose to speak about their transformations, who used what they learned to support democratic reforms in occupied Japan, who contributed to creating a society that, whatever its shortcomings, rejected militaristic imperialism and integrated into the democratic world order. Their story remains obscure compared to dramatic military campaigns or political developments, yet it reveals how warfare's experiences transform individuals in ways that influence societies, how confronting alternative systems forces recognition that ideological certainties may be propaganda rather than truth, and how direct observation of different possibilities can plant seeds of transformation that bear fruit in subsequent generations.